We are now covering skates, rays, ratfish, or chimeras, also known as. In this particular group of organisms, we're still in the class chondrichthyes, and remember, chondros means cartilage and ichthyes means fish, and so they're essentially still fish, they're just not bony fish. This time they're in the class Elasmobrachii, and when we're looking at Elasmobrachii, this is pronounced E-I, not I-I. Also, elasmos means plate and branch means gill. So a gill-like plate makes sense if we're going to make up this term that encompasses what these organisms are about. Up in the top right-hand corner here, I've circled, you can see that this is a blue spotted ribbon tail, and then on the opposite side of that, that is a bullseye round stingray. As we've talked about before, we mentioned the fact that there are around 850 different species of sharks, skates, rays, and chimeras, so cartilaginous fish in general. But if we're looking at this information, we notice that sharks were only accounting for 350 species, so the remainder of those organisms have to come from the rays and the skates. There are about 450 to 550 different species out there. They did evolve from sharks, and if we're looking at that, we're saying, okay, that the pectoral fins of the shark have elongated. And so what we're looking at over here, sorry about that writing there. If we're looking at this over here, what we can see are a few different things. We can see the ray down here and the elongation of the pectoral fins that I've drawn a line through that came from the shark. So here's the shark's medial line, and then the pectoral fins extend out from that. And of course, in this particular case, they had a streamlined body, which is an advanced trait. And then in this stingrays, because they were demersal, they're sitting on the bottom of the ocean floor, they essentially didn't need to have all those extensions like the dorsal fin being so prominent, so therefore they got rid of that. These particular organisms are sometimes very social. They have the opportunity to interact with humans, as some of you might have had the opportunity to do in the Cayman Islands for the Stingray City. But they can live in groups, or they can actually live alone, and you'll find them in estuaries or in the open ocean. And so when you're walking in estuaries, one of the things that you want to make sure that you do is you do the shuffle, and that's really important because you don't want to accidentally step on the barb of one of these organisms. The question at hand is this a shark or is it a ray? It's quite funny to look at some of these and wonder and think that maybe it's going to be a ray. In the case of this organism right here, this is actually an angel shark. So it's actually a shark itself. It has the pectoral fins located here. It has pelvic fins down in the back there. It's also cartilaginous. But what differs from some of these sharks and some of these rays? This guy over here is actually a ray. It is related to rays because of a few different reasons, and one of the main reasons is the location of the gill slits that we're going to look at in just a moment. So this particular fish is known as a tropical sawfish. So let's go ahead and take a deeper look into these particular organisms, the saw shark versus the tropical sawfish. First and foremost, they're both cartilaginous organisms. However, one actually is related to rays and the other one is more related to sharks. So if we scroll in a little bit closer here, you can note a couple things. First off, this particular organism that I'm noting here is actually the saw shark, while the organism over here on the right is the sawfish. Also, this organism being circled here is the saw shark, and the one on the right is the sawfish. You might have noticed right off the bat that, of course, the shape of the extended rostrum is a little bit different, but the biggest thing to note is going to be the barbels that exist on the saw shark. So if you notice right here and right here, these are sense structures that these particular organisms use to find food in the water. They also, both of them, have on their snouts or extended rostrum sense structures that can pick up electrical stimuli, similar to that of what we've seen in regular organisms as well. Another difference that is noted here is going to be the location of the gills. So these external gill slits that I've highlighted here for you indicate that this is a saw fish simply because they're located on the ventral side. Whereas if we were to look at it on a saw shark, they would actually be located more on the side edge. And if you can see here, I'm going to kind of put this in the box or the circle. Maybe I'm not, I don't know. So right here are going to be the gill slits for these particular organisms, and they're located more on the side as opposed to ventrally located. When talking about the body shape, as we've already mentioned in previous slides, the body has changed to a few different things, as we can note here. They have flattened bodies, and that's easily seen when you're looking at a profile view. So if we were to draw that out, what we'd be able to see is kind of like this flattened body, just like that, where this would be the anterior end and this would be the posterior end where the tail is. They have 5 ventrally located gill slits, which is very common to what we've seen in sharks, because remember, sharks are from 5 to 7. These organisms are centrally just 5. They have a high brain weight to body weight ratio, and what that tells us is that that might increase their level of intelligence. And then, of course, what we already mentioned on the last slide is, of course, the extension of these pectoral fins right here. And you can see that on this skate. Now, we've already dissected a ray, but just to kind of give you some reminders of what you saw, is that you saw a caudal tail, and this caudal tail, in the case of your dissection, was actually just a whip tail. You might have seen some thorns on your organisms, or instead of a thorn, you might actually have just seen some spines, or of course a barb that is mentioned when we look at the whole Steve Irwin issue and how he died. You're able to see the eyes, and then just posterior to the eyes were the spiracles, really important for these particular organisms because they're utilizing those to do respiration, taking in water, allowing them to sit on the bottom of the ocean floor and extract the oxygen for survival. If we're looking at the ventral region here, again, the gill slits are located on this region, and when you dissected them, you opened them up and you saw the 2 parts of it. You would have seen the 2 parts of one being the gill slits, and then, of course, the gill filaments there on the inside. They were the gray or cream-like structure, depending upon your organism. You had that ventrally located mouth, and as you had that mouth, you would have noticed that grinding plate that exists as opposed to having some really sharp teeth. I remember they take and they grind their organisms down in order to consume them, and they have a really large esophagus which goes into that narrow area of the cardiac stomach. Again, because these organisms are chondrichthyes, they too have claspers for males in order to do reproduction. Now, when it comes to size, lots of people think, oh my gosh, rays, they're relatively small, maybe 12 inches in size. But the reality is that rays can get quite large, and you can see that just by viewing this top photo up here of this diver or free diver holding on to or gently touching the top of this manta ray. Now, please keep in mind that if you are diving with these organisms, you need to be extra careful and gentle, and it's not for going for a ride is not okay. It takes a lot of energy for them to pull you along in the water column, and they need to conserve that for when they're going to feed. If we're going to look at the smallest ray, we're going to look at a short-nosed electric ray, and you're going to see that a little bit later on. And we're talking about super small, 4 inches across, yes, essentially the size of your hand, and weighs only about a pound in weight. If we're looking at the largest ray, we're looking at the manta ray, and that's what you see up in the top left-hand corner and in the bottom corner here. So in this particular case right here, you've got a manta ray that was extracted out of the water, and they utilize these organisms for lots of different things. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on. These can weigh thousands of pounds, and in the case of just the average size, you're really looking about 20 inches from most anterior, posterior, and wingtip area in size. I'm going to show you a couple other organisms on the next couple slides that kind of, make you go, wow, I didn't see that coming. All right, so here is that wow factor. What you are looking at are giant stingrays. And you can see this particular gentleman right here, Jeff Corwin, and he does the Jeff Corwin Experience or Sea Rescues with SeaWorld. Either of them, you're going to see him on his TV show. But they were able to measure some of these guys and were able to find some of the largest stingrays in the Mekong Delta, and that's over in Vietnam, in fresh water. And you're talking about thousands of pounds that these particular organisms weigh, and we're talking about, feet, 14, 15 feet in length. For a freshwater stingray, that's a really pretty long organism. Now, we mentioned generally about their feeding habits earlier when we talked about their grinding plate and how they consume their food. But in this particular case, they are mainly carnivores or carnivorous organisms. However, if we're looking at the manta ray, the largest of the rays, it's going to be a filter feeder. And so you have these extensions, or there's horns that you saw in the previous slide. You can see kind of like over in this particular area how they would be drawn off. But when we're looking at this, that allows for them to kind of funnel in food that they're going to consume. They are bottom dwellers, and of course, since their mouth is ventrally located, that actually benefits them, because when they're feeding on things like crabs and then clams, what happens is they simply just kind of swim over them and gobble them up and grind down that shell made up of really hard keratin in order to consume the organism. And of course, they'll also feed on clams and crabs as well. What I'd like for you to do after you get to the end of this slide and listening is I'd like for you to look up the electric ray. And the electric ray is really kind of crazy. And so you can see I've included a picture of what's known as the lesser electric ray. But if you look up electric rays and note the Christmas tree portion, so in the text box you can write electric rays, Christmas tree, and it'll actually show you an electric ray that has the ability to power a Christmas tree. So I'd really like for you to check that out. But really quickly before you get there, we had already mentioned the fact that they had the grinding plate when they were feeding, and that's just mentioned right here again for you. Again, look it up on the web, Christmas tree, electric rays, watch the short little video clip that goes along with that, and it's amazing that they have the ability to stun up to 220 volts. And this isn't necessarily that they're stunning everything every time, but they can emit the electricity or these voltage from pores on the side of their body. All right, now that you've had the chance to look at the Christmas tree thing, I thought that was a pretty cool opportunity for you to take a look at what they can do. In turn, here's another one. This is known as the short nose electric ray. So again, anywhere from 8 volts to 220 volts. You have to be really careful, because if you were to get zapped by one of these, it can definitely do some damage to you. As far as movement goes in the water, or locomotion for these organisms, they really have the cool look of ripples that run down their body. So as they're moving through the water, they either glide like the manta ray, or what they're going to do is do this ripple pattern. And the ripple actually transports an electrical impulse down their body in the form of a wave. And so you can kind of see as I'm drawing here, it would start at the most anterior region here, and then it would go to the posterior region, and it would cause these muscle contractions that allow for the ray to have that movement, and then it allows for them to move forward. You can also check that out online if you'd like to go ahead and take a moment and look that up. Really important thing, you guys saw this in the shark, was a really oily liver. I know it wasn't as oily in the ray when you dissected it. However, they had a really large liver that you had to remove in order to see everything underneath, and that liver does provide them with oily, which allows them to have buoyancy. And again, if they stop swimming, they're negatively buoyant, and so the oily liver gives them neutral buoyancy to move throughout the water column. And there's that thing. If they stop swimming, they will sink. I included this picture to show you how amazing these particular organisms are. And what you're actually looking at here is a ray who's flapping its wings up and down in order to move throughout the water column, and they actually have the ability to propel themselves out of the water. In this particular case, you're really only looking at a couple feet, maybe 2 at the most. When they're flying out of the water, it's just really cool to see. So if you ever have that chance to look at it, it's great. The other thing is if you're ever in the water and there's a huge group of these particular organisms, it's probably best bet that you kind of move out of the way a little bit to safety, just for the fact that they do have the barb and it isn't a means for defense for them. So we've already talked about these organisms coming from sharks, but a little bit more history about these particular organisms is that they actually date back to about 150 million years ago. And you can see this particular organism, the cow nose ray, and he might not look old himself, but his relatives definitely go back some millions of years. The hard thing about these organisms is dating them and knowing when they came from, because they leave a really poor fossil record. Because remember, these organisms, again, are made up of cartilage, and cartilage just breaks down in the ocean really easily. And so most of the body that I've outlined here isn't going to leave anything behind. But what we're able to look at is those that grinding plate, or those grinding teeth, which are made up of enamel. And enamel will maintain itself in the ocean for quite some amount of time, and we've used that to date these particular organisms. All right, many questions are asked about what is the difference between a skate and a ray. And on the left here you can see a spotted eagle ray. Such a majestic creature. I've seen one of these while I was in Cozumel diving on a drift dive, and it was probably about 6-7 feet in wingspan, but it is a ray. So let's just take a look at some of these differences. As far as reproduction goes, organisms as skates would be, they'd be oviparous. And remember that ovo means egg, right? If we're looking at the rays themselves are considered viviparous, where vi means live. And again, those are our root words we already know. As far as the dorsal fin presents itself in each case, the skates will have a dorsal fin, and the rays, it's actually absent or reduced. And so if we go ahead and look over here on the spotted eagle ray, you'll note that there's actually no dorsal fin, which goes along with what we just talked about. The next part is that spines may exist on rays, or it could have some dorsal thorns, so little thorns that kind of pop out of the back in this particular region. And then I think some of you actually had that when you were doing your dissection. Okay, so this right here is a skate, and remember that we already mentioned the fact that the skates are oviparous, where ovo means egg. And what you're actually looking at is the egg of the skate. So this is the body that I've drawn the red line down. And then in this particular case, this is the yolk sac. And the yolk sac is what provides nutrients for these particular organisms while they're inside of their egg case. And if we're looking at their egg case, this is what it looks like. Very similar to the whole idea of the mermaid purse that we saw on the bamboo shark that I had passed around the classroom. So the organism actually survives within here, and these little extensions are really a smart little addition to the egg case itself. Because the skate is laying the eggs in the water, it needs to make sure that it kind of holds on to something, and so it actually wraps around seaweeds or any kind of sea grass to keep it more stable in an environment as opposed to just floating in the open ocean. Since we've been talking about the body shape that differentiates between the skate and the ray, what you're looking at here is a ray, and then over here would be the skate. In this case, you can see the barb down here, which makes it a ray. Over here on the skate, you can see some of these thorns that exist down the dorsal ridge, as well as in the back here, which is showing us that they have a dorsal fin, which is absent, of course, or really reduced over here in the ray. The last thing we're going to talk about are the ratfish, or the chimeras. And these organisms really only make up a very small portion of the species population that we talked about in chondrichthyes. So being 800, and then 350 of those belonging to sharks, 450 to 550 belonging to skates and rays. We wrap it up with 30 species of chimeras. And these little organisms are slightly different from sharks, but looking physically different from the skates and rays. But again, they're made up of cartilage, therefore they belong in class Chondrichthyes. They're considered deep water fish, as you can see here, and a big difference is that they only have one gill slit as opposed to what we saw in the skates and rays, which was 5, and the sharks are 5 to 7. And another thing is it's covered actually by skin as opposed to having a whole bunch of slits throughout the entire body. Anyway, the last thing that you want to note here is that they contain a venomous spine. So if you ever see one of these, you just want to be really careful about being around them. So this is the actual chimera. And if we're looking at the chimera, we are looking at a dorsal fin, which is also similarly found in the shark itself. We have a second dorsal here. They have the pectoral fins and the pelvic and anal fins. We're kind of looking at a dorsal or upper view of these mating spotted ratfish, and it gives us a better view, of course, of the actual fin itself, as I've outlined here on the sides. You can see that they're slightly elongated. These organisms are actually mating at this particular moment, where you would essentially have a male, of course, and then you would have a female in order to complete this, since they are sexually reproducing organisms that require gametes from 2 different donors.